Great. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Delegate Lori Charkoudian. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Transit Caucus and really appreciate everyone coming today. This is our second of three briefings this session. So hopefully you all were able to join us last 2 weeks ago when we had sort of Transit 101 with a presentation from DLS and from MDOT. If you missed that, you can find both of those recordings on the Transit Caucus website and the YouTube page, which Rose is going to put into the comments in just a few minutes. There they are. And today we're really excited to have folks from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments with us. Before I introduce them, I'll just mention that next week we have a number of people who will be here presenting. So today we'll be focused on the DC area public transportation systems, and then next week we'll have the Baltimore metropolitan area public transportation systems. So hopefully you can join us for that as well. Without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce the folks that we have here today. So we're really pleased to be joined by Clark Mercer, who's the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, Kanti Shrikant, the Deputy Executive Director, and Eric Randall, the Transportation Engineer and Program Manager. And we've asked them to give us an overview of the DC metro area's transit system and the needs right now, and what we should be thinking about as we're considering funding for the systems and policies around transit in the state. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to pass it to you. We'll take, they'll have a presentation. We'll generally take questions at the end, but if you have questions that are clarifying, that are important to understand kind of the flow of what's being discussed, feel free to put them in the chat. Clark, I think I'm passing it to you.
Okay, thank you, Delegate. And that was a great introduction. Clark Mercer, the Executive Director here at the Council of Governments. 2 years in on the job as Executive Director. And for the previous 8 years, I was in Richmond as the Governor's Chief of Staff. So I certainly appreciate that you're in the middle of session and what that entails. I was presenting to the Speaker's Emergency Committee on the federal effects on state funding in Virginia on Saturday morning. And the legislature there wrapped up their session later that afternoon. So I know you all are busy, and we will try to be quick with our slides. I will just say from the outset, if there are any data sets or issues that we bring up where you need more information, we are happy to take those as due outs and get them to you. And also, this is not a one session issue to tackle. We recognize that to get our transit systems the proper funding they need and management that they need for long-term sustainable funding and efficiencies, it's going to take more than one session. So happy to come to Annapolis as well. Kanti is on this call as well. Kanti is my Deputy Executive Director, but he also is the Director of our Transportation Planning Board, which is our NPO for the Capital Region, and Eric Randall, who has worked in transit both at COG and in many other organizations for his career. So we're gonna jump right into it. Eric, can you share the second slide? Eric is. Now we're on to slide number 2 there. So we will cover kind of an overview of our transit system here in the DMV, 3 states, multiple operators, kind of give you an idea. We're on slide 2, Eric, on who the customers are in the region, who takes which type of transit and how often. We'll talk a little bit about transient funding writ large across the country. The issues that, in particular, WMATA are facing are not unique to WMATA. Every major transit system in the country is kind of coming off of a federal funding that's expiring, the new normal kind of post-COVID work environment. There are some particular unique aspects to WMATA's funding, though, that we will talk about. We will talk about the 2018 capital funding that I'm sure many of you were involved in helping make happen, and kind of what that has led to, and what some not oversights, but what some items from that funding that need to be addressed kind of moving forward. Talk a little bit about DMV Moves, which is a joint effort between the Council of Governments and the Metro Board to come up with some recommendations both on service and cost efficiencies, and then revenue options moving forward. And then I will kind of close things out with what we've heard from our elected officials, our stakeholders, in terms of next steps and when we'll deliver recommendations to the region. Eric, if you can go to slide 3 now. Let's go on 1 here. Cover that. There we go. So I think folks are probably familiar with the Council of Governments. There are MPOs all over the country. If you have over 25,000 folks, the federal government requires that you have a metropolitan planning organization. Every transportation project with a federal dollar needs to be in an MPO's long-term plan. So there's hundreds of MPOs. There are many large metro areas that also have a Council of Governments. Those regions realize it's not just transportation that we need to work on as a region. There are lots of topics that don't just stop at a border on a map. So housing, homelessness, public safety. We run 24 unique public safety programs for the region, including the mutual aid agreement, which allows Maryland public safety officers and emergency responders to respond across state lines. We have a clean air, clean water program. Obviously, air and water does not stop on the map. And we run a procurement program for the region, working with our local governments, items that your local governments purchase, where we can purchase them in bulk and leverage cost savings for the localities we do. We've got about 125 staff, and we're headquartered here by Union Station in Washington, D.C. And with that, I'll hand things off to Conti, who will give you a little bit of an overview of transit in the region.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Clark, Eric. So the National Capital Region is one of the densest and economically vibrant regions in the country that supports about 6 million people and about 3.5 million jobs. And between these people and jobs, there are about 17 million trips that people make on our transportation system every day. They travel about 120 million miles every day. All of this is possible because the region is served by many transit systems. We have 14 bus systems, including 5 in Maryland, and we have 5 rail systems, including 2 in Maryland. So annually, between bus and rail, there are about 450 million trips that are done on our public transportation system. And even though about 85% of all of this happens on the metro rail and metro bus, many of those metro rail and metro bus trips originate on a local bus or a commuter rail. And that's why that system is so very critical. Next slide. So in understanding who are being served by this transit system, if one looks at whichever metric you use, if you look at the people of color, if you look at people with lower income, or if you look at those who do not own a car, a majority of them, particularly those who don't own a car, majority of them use the bus. But amongst people of color and people who do not own a car, about 1/3 of them also use the rail. So these trips are also being made across a spectrum of our day-to-day activities. If one looks at all the trips that are being made on our transportation system each day, I mentioned that 17 million, only 1 in 5 is commuting to or from work. So majority of the trips are for all other purposes, schooling, shopping, medical visits. So this means that the public transportation system should be there at all times of the day and at all days of the week. Next slide. So the region's transit system has not had enough funding to operate and maintain the system in an excellent state of good repair for a long time, even before COVID. They've all been doing the very best that they can within the resources they've had. So this gap that exists between what the resource needed and the resource that is available, it became more acute during and after the COVID pandemic. Significant ridership loss led to loss in fare revenues. The supply chain disruptions, labor force upheavals, all led to large inflationary effects. And the fact that we were already facing a funding gap, all have come together. So it's like a trifecta of events have now come together. And this is not just in the National Capital Region, but throughout the country, as you can see on this line. All major regions in the country are facing this particular issue. Next slide. So in our region, Clark talked about Metro is a little bit unique in terms of how it is funded. And it also carries 85% of the transit ridership, as I mentioned earlier. So let's take a look at Metro as an example. The funds for the capital investments in maintaining the system in a state of good repair comes from the three states, Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And it comes from two large sources. One, the federal PREA Act, where the federal government provides $150 million per year, which is matched equally by the three states, $150 million. So $300 million per year in PREA funding, and that started in 2010. And the three states have a dedicated funding for capital, $500 million per year, which started in 2018-2019 timeframe. So what you see on the chart to the right is Metro was able to use that capital funding, issue bonds so that it can have the money when it needs to undertake the state of good repair activities. And they had been reducing the backlog substantially with that funding. But one of the inherent issues was those two sources of funding, the PREA funding and the state capital dedicated capital funding, both of them were not indexed to inflation, to account for inflation. So this means that by 2028, the $300 million per year in PREA funding, it would have lost 60% of its purchasing power. And by 2028, the $500 million in the state's dedicated capital funding, that would have lost 32% of its purchasing power. So with this loss in the ability of those funding to pay for services, Metro has indicated that by 2028, whatever money is coming from those two sources will be used to service the bonds that have already been issued, meaning there will be no fund for additional state of good repair investments, and the backlog will once again begin to grow. And when state of good repair backlog grows, the system becomes less reliable. That could drive ridership away. That could then affect revenue, and you get into that spiral. Next slide. So this indicates how currently Metro is funded. It is funded by the three states and the local jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. And they're all, the states and the local jurisdictions are all using different sources of monies. And much of that funding is decided on an annual basis, which means there isn't a lot of predictability, which makes planning operations or planning for capital investments exceedingly difficult, and which then subsequently ends up leading to issues with either service quality or reliability. Next slide. Back when Metro was built, there indeed was a unified vision for transit in our region, both on the service that this system would provide and how it would be funded and all of that. But then the region went in a different direction, from this unified regional vision to having multiple transit systems. Having multiple transit systems has had its benefits, but there have also been some unintended consequences, such as many small visions for the different systems, and those systems not always coordinated in their service design and service delivery, and all of them vying for the limited and shrinking pot of money. So for a region such as ours, which not only currently has 6 million people, 3.5 million jobs, but it is also forecast to add an additional 1.5 million people, an additional 1 million jobs over the next 25 years. For all of that to happen and for the region's economy to grow, we will need a world-class transit system. And that is why the DMV Moves initiative was created. It's a task force of elected officials from the 24 local governments in our national capital region, the two states, Maryland and Virginia, the District of Columbia, as well as the legislatures from all three jurisdictions. That is what makes up the DMV Moves task force. Next slide. So collectively, the DMV Moves leadership has come up with this vision that recognizes that transit is the backbone of an integrated world-class mobility network that would make the National Capital Region a thriving global economy, a preferred home and a leader in innovation and environmental sustainability and social equity as well. Next slide. So the task force, based on that vision, identified specific goals to guide the future work to address the public transportation systems need in the capital region. And those goals start by recognizing that for transit to become the preferred travel choice, it will need to take people where they want to go when they want to travel. With so many different transit systems operating in this tri-state area, the rider's experience should also be seamless and convenient. And that by focusing development around transit stations, we would be able to provide connections to economic opportunities and thereby enhance the quality of life while advancing the economic development of the region. And doing this will require long-term, predictable, and sustainable transit funding, as well as accountability by all the transit operators. And then it's also important that the region be set up to provide the best-in-class transit workforce for this thing to become sustainable. Next slide. So the DMV Moves task force established two advisory groups, one that is made up of all the transit operators and the CAOs and the CFOs of the local governments, and the state transit department representatives. And it established another advisory group made up of representatives of the communities, the business leaders, chambers of commerce, labor union representatives, and other interest groups. So these advisory groups work with the staff to work out the details of all the issues that the task force has identified, and the advisory groups bring back recommendations to the task force. Next slide. So one of the first things that the advisory groups recognized was it needed to better understand what the residents of the region expected of its transit system. So it conducted a public survey to get a better understanding and of what they experienced and what the public saw as challenges and the top priorities for the DMV Moves to work on. And what we heard from the public was both bus and rail users is that the service is not frequent enough and the routes were not convenient or efficient. So providing more frequent peak and off-peak service is a priority. Designing service routes that are efficient and fast, including new bus routes, became a top priority for the DMV Moves task force. Next slide. So in trying to address this issue or take advantage of this opportunity, the DMV Moves developed a three-pronged approach. One, every transit operator would find cost efficiencies within their system, and importantly, they would come together to collaborate and work together to find cost efficiencies by teaming up together, pooling the resources to provide both cost efficiencies and service efficiencies. And then on another prong, all of the transit systems would work to prioritize their service and operations planning in a manner that would meet these goals and objectives of the task force and the various goals that the region has set for itself, including climate goals. And then finally, the region would come together to explore and find new revenues that would be predictable, it would be sustainable over the long term, and it would be reliable. So the DMV moves task force established working groups that is made up of staffs from all the transit agencies to spell out the details in which they would work together, they would collaborate, they would share resources to find cost efficiencies and service efficiencies on one hand, while we also look for additional revenues on the other hand. So my colleague Eric Randall will now briefly explain to you what those working groups are working on in terms of collaborative opportunities.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So as Director Srikanth already said, we have a number of working groups formed up primarily of transit planners and transit executives from across the region to look at both improving the customer experience, bringing together everybody's good work that's being done regionally, as well as looking at the cost efficiencies through economies of scale and better centralization of what could be improved. So on the customer side, looking at more consistent fare policies in terms of what people pay, what age kids ride free, other discounted weekly and monthly pass products that are available, making those available across the region. Establishing a more objective and common set of regional guidelines. Where should bus service be prioritized? And how do we get that to the customers? How do we provide better information to customers? And then, of course, looking at bus priority strategies. When buses are slowed up at particular hotspots or intersections, how can we identify and prioritize improvements in those areas to make buses faster, which is better for both customers and for the bus operator on its cost side. In the back of house, if you will, we're looking at administrative and cost efficiencies. Where can we do things together? That can be cooperative bus purchase or procurement of other materials, as well as using our assets together. Some of the training facilities that, for instance, Metro has available, could local operators make use of those? And then training and certification. Right now, particularly operating across a tri-state area, Maryland, DC, Virginia, each has its own regulations and codes. Can we make training and certification equal across those programs so we don't have to spend a great deal of administrative effort getting, say, an escalator maintenance technician certified in every state to operate the different escalators across the system? So we've been looking at those six primary areas. So each working group is working on particular goals. I'm not going to read these in detail, but for instance, fare integration, looking at that universal transfer credit. If I get off any bus and I get on Metro Rail, or get off Metro Rail and get on any bus, whether it be Metro Bus or Frederick Transit or Charles County Van Gogh, making sure that everybody gets that same sort of, hey, I already paid my initial fare, deduct it from the cost of my second leg of my trip on this subsequent vehicle. Then again, looking at universal discounts, past products, and that goes around the area of the six working groups and their topics. So we're still in the midst of working out some of these things, again, with that emphasis on making things better for the customer and how can we achieve operating cost savings in the long run. Though some of these may require some upfront effort and cost investment to make practical. So I'll end there and turn it back over. So I think this goes to Clark.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I will just kind of follow up on those six work groups. A lot of those recommendations that Eric just talked about, those topics, have been made before over the last several decades, making sure that signage is consistent throughout this region. Bus numbers, there's a rhyme and reason to the numbering that makes sense. The back end technology that folks can check to see when a bus is coming, trying to make sure those systems either talk to one another or the same system, right? It's very confusing when you go to the Pentagon and there's 12 different signs that are working on 12 different systems. It's hard to get around this region. And so one of the first things we did when we started this effort was pull together all of the recommendations that have been made from reports that we've issued or Board of Trade has issued or your respective MDOTs and VDOTs, and ask the question, if these are recommendations that keep being made administration after administration, year after year, why haven't they been implemented? And one of the conclusions that we have drawn is that oftentimes this is a special group or commission. They make high-level recommendations, and then that commission folds and goes away, and the region is left pointing at each other, kind of wondering, what does this recommendation mean and who takes ownership of it? So you will see that the timeline here for these work groups is to report out in the next couple of months specifics when it comes to what is the problem we're trying to solve for, who would take ownership of this issue, and then what obstacles are in the way to implementing it. Is this a local government regulation that needs to be changed? Is this something that WMATA can do universally? Would it take state legislation to accomplish this goal? And we are committed to keeping kind of the backbone of DMV moves together during the implementation phase for these recommendations. And we feel that that has been kind of the one piece that has really been missing when you look at previous reports. On financial, we're wrapping this up to take questions, but when you look at kind of financial stability for transit, what are some overarching takeaways that we've found so far? One, the monies that Metro receives needs to be bondable. And the more hands that tax touches before it gets to Metro, the harder it is for Metro to bond that money or get favorable rates. You hear about a dedicated tax that could go to Metro. That is usually mentioned because that would be the most direct way to get monies to Metro that are unencumbered, that can be bondable. That's not the only way for WMATA to get monies from the state and localities.
And you kind of saw it.
But Virginia and Maryland and DC, when you add your respective requirements or nuances to your legislation that has money flow to Metro, that encumbers the money in a way that makes it harder to bond. In Virginia, the way that Metro pays the bills, gets the bills paid, half of it's paid by localities, half of it's paid by the state. And the way that the state does bonding and looks at its bonding ratio, you can't use state dollars for bonding capital, or it would affect the colleges and universities and other folks that already work out of that bonding pool. So we're looking at ways the localities might be able to get money to Metro so that it can be bonded and that money can be unencumbered. Funding modernization and efficiencies. We'll see this on the next slide as well, but there's definitely seems to be a consensus that we need to make sure that Metro's system is safe and efficient. We'll talk a little bit on the next slide about whether that means expanding the rail side or not, but there definitely is consensus when you look at automation and some other technologies. Signaling is a big one for Metro that has never been replaced. They're operating on a 1970s signaling platform. There seems to be great consensus that we need to address those areas of emphasis. Then indexed and capped funding. So Metro, Conti mentioned that the money coming out of 18 was not indexed, so it was a flat amount of money, and the buying power has been greatly affected since 2018. There seems to be a general recognition that the monies that go to Metro needs to be indexed at some amount, whether that's 3% or whether it's something that's tied to some inflationary measure, but that Virginia, Maryland, and DC all need to agree on what that means. The capped growth in 18, I will tell you, if you asked Virginia, Maryland, and DC what their concept of what that cap meant and didn't mean, it was three different definitions. So whatever money is going to Metro that is new funding, it needs to be indexed to an amount that all three states agree on. On the flip side, Metro has certainly said and that they want to live within their means and understand that some guardrails on the amount that they can grow from one year to the next needs to be part of this conversation. And again, I would just say, wherever we land on that, the recommendation is going to be that Maryland and DC and Virginia have to agree on what that growth is from one year to the next. Because again, in talking to representatives both at the VDOT and MDOT and DDOT levels and elected, folks are not on the same sheet of music with what the growth year over year for Metro should be and what they should be held to. Next slide, please. So in terms of continuing what we've heard so far, keeping Metro in a state of good repair is absolutely, like everyone agrees, we cannot go back to where we were several years ago when there were fires on the tracks and the system needed to be shut down. We are asking Metro to produce, and you'll see this in the next few meetings, what monies are necessary to maintain the state of good repair that they're in now. With a recognition that no transit or transportation system anywhere in the country gets to 0% backlog, there is some healthy amount of deferred maintenance that will always sit on the books. But what amount of money does Metro need that they can bond and then have a revolving bond program so that when bonds are paid off, they can issue new bonds and we're not back, in 5 or 10 years with DMV Moves Part 2 trying to figure out how we're going to fix a capital problem. How do we put money into the system that will have a sustainable revolving bond program that keeps Metro in a state of good repair? The next bullet, I will just say that that is probably not something that every single one of the stakeholders and advocates would agree on, but there is a recognition that expanding rail is very, very expensive. And that right now, major expansions of metro rail is probably not where the focus should be. It should be on how do we make the most out of the current rail network that we have, increasing frequency, adding 8-car trains, updating a signaling system, which would be a multi-billion-dollar project, somewhere in $5 to $8 billion range. Looking to automated trains, and how do we make the most out of existing stations and bottlenecks that we have on the system. Lots of consensus that bus needs to be a place where we look if we are going to expand. The bus numbers are above pre-pandemic levels. They have been strong throughout the pandemic, with a recognition that many of the folks riding the bus have not had the luxury of being able to work from home. There is, folks mention bus rapid transit, depending on who you ask, what the definition of BRT is a little bit different. But how do we, essentially get folks riding on buses in lanes and in areas where the bus is actually moving, and making it a better value proposition, both for the rider and for the system, so that their buses aren't sitting in traffic. But it seems like the bang for your buck right now is on bus and BRT expansion as opposed to rail expansion. Next and final slide. So this Friday, our two working groups, and I will tell a little bit about who's in those working groups. Our community partners are all of your business groups, your environmental groups, your labor groups, your transit, your individuals with disabilities who ride, advocate groups. It's a very large community stakeholder group led by Jack McDowell and the Board of Trade. The government partners group are all of your chief administrative officers, the CFO of the district, and your regional transit groups that are in the region. They are meeting jointly this Friday to get an update from Metro. Metro, over the next couple of board meetings, will have some updates on both their operating budget and their capital budget. Operating has been strong. They've had 45 months of growth on the system. They recovered more riders last year than any transit system in the country. And I think you will see some positive reports on the weekday traffic on the rail in the last couple of weeks, obviously with a change with the administration and expectation of folks working out of their place of work as opposed to home. So I think you will see an update from Metro that is very positive with regards to ridership. Fare evasion has gone down by 87% with these new fare gates, which has increased money to Metro. And then they continue to listen to the stakeholders in these groups and find their own efficiencies and cost savings. On the capital side, we have a task force meeting on March 24th. I think between now and then, there will be some additional updates in terms of what monies Metro really needs, getting back to the previous slide, to maintain a state of good repair, recognizing that there will always be some amount of deferred maintenance sitting on the books. So on March 24th, our electeds, the task force comes together. They come together again on May 16th. And then this summer into the fall, we will wrap up DMV moves with another task force meeting, likely a joint COG WMATA board meeting to issue the final report. And those advisory groups will continue meeting throughout the fall. And we certainly recognize that to implement many of these recommendations is going to take leadership and cooperation in the state houses. So we're committed to keeping this group together and working with you in Annapolis, working with your counterparts in Richmond and in the district to implement recommendations that you would like to see implemented. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do you want to unshare the screens so we can see people? And it looks like Delegate Ruth, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this presentation. You mentioned positive ridership numbers with people returning back to the office, but I just wondered if we have a sense yet of how much the reductions in force in the federal government are going to affect ridership.
That is a great question, and one that I know Metro is thinking about, and I think they have a meeting later this week. I suspect you'll hear some conversation about that, but that's a great question. What's the net benefit or consequence of folks losing their jobs and obviously not taking Metro versus those who remain employed showing up more often? And they don't have crisp numbers on that yet, but it's something that I've certainly asked them to think about when they give their ridership, when they anticipate their ridership moving forward.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I guess, well, thank you. It was a great presentation. Maybe I'll ask one or two, and then we'll see if any others come up. Are there specific points in that's before the General Assembly right now? We certainly have the conversations about funding, transportation funding generally, and the various proposals to address some of the transportation capital funding issues. And then there's a variety of other pieces of legislation. And I'm just wondering if there's any that you would want to flag. Some folks I can see on here are on the budget committees, and some are on the standing committees that may be hearing the bills. But for those of us who are not necessarily on one or the other of those committees, what would be things that you would want us to be aware is happening and you would want us to be paying attention to?
Monica, do you want to chat a little bit about the bill that we did weigh in on? Monica Nunez, who's on as our government affairs lead.
Sure. The Metro Funding Modification Act, sponsored by Senator Augustine and Delegate Corman, is certainly something that we would like everyone to support and have been very grateful for their sponsoring that legislation.
Sorry, for folks who aren't on the committee that are going to consider that, can you tell us what it does?
It adjusts the funding in Maryland to re-baseline to the pre-2020 number. So it kind of adjusts for inflation, bringing up to today's number.
Okay. Thank you. I see the sponsor on here. I'm not sure. I didn't ask him to be ready to say anything, but if he wants to jump in and say a word or two about that, he would be welcome. Go ahead, Chair Corman.
No, just appreciate everyone's support. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for any of our presenters, or other questions about the? Yes, go ahead, Mr. Spears.
Hi, Charles Spears, Delegate Sheila Ruth's legislative intern this session. I just had one quick question I wanted to ask. I know the Transportation Planning Board that you were referencing earlier recently wrote a report on through running for MARC into Virginia, and I'm wondering if some of that interagency cooperation that you were talking about might help with that a little bit, move that forward.
Yeah, so Conti, you can add to this, but both VRE and MARC are participating in these work groups. And we should have mentioned, and I should have mentioned from the outset, some of our funding recommendations that we will make are not just specific to WMATA. They are going to be recommendations that would look at the long-term funding stability for our partners, including our bus and rail partners. But the answer is we'll make some recommendations. It's good that they're both at the table. And I think the fact that there can be through running through a Union Station, MARC trains into Virginia, VRE into Maryland, an entity like DMV moves is more important than ever to have folks at the table and talking, both as WMATA kind of deals with not getting federal funds from COVID and what the future looks like. The same applies to MARC and VRE as well. And those numbers will run out at some point, and folks need to factor in kind of what the long-term viability looks like. To Conti's point, there's an awful lot of folks that take MARC or VRE every day and then jump on Metro to get to work. So the systems are very much need to be integrated. And that gets to kind of the fare integration. Is there one app you can use to purchase your ticket for VRE onto Metro? Are there fare transfers? Is there a common operating system? And those are the kind of topics that they're discussing in these work groups.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for our presenters? Okay, well, we will be, this is being recorded. It will be posted on the Transit Caucus YouTube. So if you missed part of it, or if you wanted to share it, or if you have staff, or if your delegate or senator wanted to see it, if you are staff, it will be there. And excuse me. And we'll also ask our presenters to share the slides if they're willing to do that. And we'll share that with the caucus. I just want to do one more shout out for next week. We have our presenters will be John Laria of the Baltimore Regional Transit Commission, Robin Budish of Transit Choices, and Brian O'Malley of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. And they will be talking about transit in the Baltimore metropolitan region. So we hope you can join us for that. And we thank folks for joining us today. And thank you again to our presenters. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your Monday.